Chapter 14: Artistic Innovations in 15th Century Northern Europe. Let's start with the Chartreuse de Champmol, which is a Carthusian monastery started by Philip the Bold. He was brother to King Charles V. He became the Duke of Burgundy in 1363 and later the Count of Flanders through marriage to Margaret of Maille. The Well of Moses is a hexagonal well. It was originally topped with a crucifix, as well as Mary and some saints. What we see are some Old Testament prophets. You can see their garments that are swelling around them. This was originally painted bright colors by Jean Malouel. You might notice something a bit odd about Moses. Look closely at his head. Those are horns. Now, this is because there's been a misinterpretation of a verse in the Bible. This is Exodus 34, 29 to 35. So what we now interpret as rays of light was at that point interpreted as horns. In addition to these prophets, we have 6 weeping angels at the top. Now, these prophets were chosen specifically because they had foreseen Christ's death. They include Moses, David, Jeremiah, Daniel, Zechariah, and Isaiah. Here are some details from that. This is the altarpiece at Chartreuse de Champmol. Duke Philip commissioned this in 1394. This is one panel, one wing of the altarpiece that we see. This is the infancy of Christ. This includes the Annunciation and Visitation. The other side is the presentation in the temple and the flight into Egypt. We see the Archangel Gabriel coming to Mary over here on the left-hand side, and we have the white lilies. On the far right-hand side, we have the Visitation is when Mary goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is expecting a baby as well, known to be John the Baptist. So this is the other wing, the right wing. This includes the presentation in the temple, as well as the flight into Egypt. So we've got them bringing the baby into the temple on the far left, and on the far right, we have them traveling. So we see Mary holding the Christ child on the donkey. These are about 5 feet tall to give you an idea of the scale here. This is Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, created by the Limburg brothers. The Very Rich Hours of the Duke of Berry. Book of Hours is basically a devotional book that was very popular at this time. This was created for the Duke of Berry, who was the brother of Philip the Bold and King Charles V. The Limburg brothers, Herman and Jean, their uncle was Jean Malouel, who had painted the Well of Moses. These pages, unfortunately, are unfinished because the brothers both died in 1416 of the plague. So this is the January page. So the dates are missing from the very top, but we see everything else is pretty much finished. So we have the Duke at the table in front of the fireplace. The wicker screen frames him, that circular thing in the back, so you can see where he is. And we've got him talking with the clergyman here, also seated at the table. On the wall is his coat of arms. Here's another page. This is the July page. So we can actually see here where all of the dates and everything are on top. And down below, we actually have a pastoral scene of them harvesting a crop, as well as having the sheep out grazing. We've got this wonderful castle in the background, an interesting triangular castle, but a wonderful castle nonetheless. We see the astrological sign there at the top. Remember, that's very important because they're having to plant in different seasons, know when to harvest, when lambing season is, things like that. Now we're going into Bohemia and England. This is St. Matthew and the Angel. You can see that the figures are getting more three-dimensional, especially his garment. You can see that the highlights, the folds are very pronounced in his clothing, so you really get a sense that this is an actual garment that he is wearing. We still have a very simple, if nothing, background, but his garment itself is becoming more elaborate. Now remember, the angel is Matthew's symbol, and so that's why that angel is included here. This is the Wilton diptych. We have King Richard II kneeling before his patron saint, as well as Christ, and we have the Virgin and Child on the other side. This is called the Wilton diptych because the Wilton family had owned this piece. You will also notice that the angels wear emblems of Richard on their garments. A diptych basically means an altarpiece that has two parts. Die meaning two. Now, King Richard II ruled England from 1377 to 1399. This is the Merode triptych. We're going to spend a little time analyzing this piece. This is a triptych, has 3 panels. The 2 side panels would fold in on the middle one. The middle panel is the Annunciation. So we have Gabriel coming to Mary, saying she's with child. But you will notice that this is definitely set in a typical house. Now, the interesting thing is, in Northern Europe, we tend to have more middle-class homes versus more upper-class homes being depicted in Italy. This piece measures 25 by 46 inches to give you an idea of the scale. It's called Merode because that was an early owner of this piece. So we have Mary there reading her Bible, another Bible or book of hours on the table. We have a candle that interestingly has been snuffed out on that table. Some say this is a symbol of Christ's life being snuffed out on the cross. One of the things about Northern European painting is that there's lots of symbols in here. So here we can look at the details. There's the snuffed out candle. Here are the white lilies, which of course represent Mary. Again, the details, these are things that would have been in a normal class home. And we also see this cherubim, this little child coming from the window holding a cross, again, most likely referencing Christ on the cross. On the left-hand side, we have the donors to this piece, the people who paid to have it created, and they're kneeling in a garden. Now, this might be referencing a prayer for fertility. On the right-hand side, we have Joseph in his carpenter shop. Through the back windows, we can see a wonderful city. Great use of architecture back there. You will also notice that in the center as well as the right-hand side, we have use of the grid of the ceiling beams, helping create this sense of depth in both of these panels. Both panels do seem to be very crowded with the figures or other elements actually coming into or coming out of the frame in some cases. Now, some say that Joseph is working on a mouse trap. Reason for this is because of a well-known story that St. Augustine said. He used the mouse trap to explain salvation, saying the cross of the Lord was the devil's mousetrap. So some people think that that's what Joseph is creating in the right side. Jan van Eyck. This is Madonna in a church. So Jan van Eyck is credited with the invention of oil painting. He didn't actually create oil painting, but he definitely utilized it amazingly and popularized it. He worked for the Count of Holland, then the Duke of Burgundy. In the Madonna in a church, we see the Madonna and Child being so large and imposing inside this church. Behind the screen in the very back, we actually see angels singing. Very interestingly, we look at this church and we can see that the light is actually coming in from the north, which would not have actually happened in Northern Europe. Therefore, it is a miracle. The inscription on her robe is from the Song of Solomon. It reads, She is more beautiful than the sun. The Ghent altarpiece. We're actually going to spend a lot of time with this because there's a lot of details I really want you to understand. This was created for the Cathedral of St. John in Ghent in 1432. So Jan van Eyck and his older brother Hubert worked on this altarpiece. His older brother died in 1426. There are 20 images total. This is it closed. We're going to see it open in just a moment. This was created for the donors, and you will see them in the bottom right and left panels. Jodocus Vide and his wife Elizabeth Borluut. So you can see that they are in the red, again in the bottom panels. The Ghent altarpiece is considered to be the high point of Northern European painting of this time period and has had a very interesting past. It had an elaborate frame that has now been lost. It was stolen in 1566, returned, then stolen again in 1794, returned, survived a fire in 1822, stolen by Hitler's army in 1942, has had quite the experiences. It is 12 feet high by 17 feet wide. All right, so let's analyze this. Bottom register, we've got the donor, and then we have John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, and they're being painted as if they are sculptures. They're painted in grayscale or griselle. Then the next register, coming up from that, interestingly, all four of the panels function as one image. Again, it's the Annunciation. We have the Archangel Gabriel coming with white lilies, and we have the Virgin Mary here, of course, dutifully reading her Bible, and we have the Holy Spirit as a dove above her head. Again, this is set in a middle-class home of the time. The very upper register. This is prophets and sibyls, and those words that are floating on the scrolls around their heads, these are their prophecies written in a script. This is the Ghent altarpiece opened. There's a lot going on here. All right, so the low register, the very bottom, let's go through that. There's just judges, then Christian soldiers, then holy hermits, pilgrim saints. So just judges, Christian soldiers, holy hermits, and pilgrim saints. In the large panel in the center is a mass. And we'll look at a close-up of that in just a moment. On the very bottom right corner, you will see that one figure is much larger than everyone else. He's got the red robe on. That is St. Christopher. Now, the story goes that he helped the Christ child cross a river by putting him on his shoulders. He is typically depicted as a giant. The just judges, that far lower left one, was originally stolen in 1934, and this is actually a replacement piece. The top register. So we've got the court of heaven in the center, surrounded by angels playing instruments, and Adam and Eve. You will notice that on top of Adam and Eve in griselle, above are Adam and Eve in griselle, are Cain and Abel. The Van Eyck brothers were known for their technique of building up layers of color, using layer after layer after layer in order to create these rich, deep colors. The very bottom of this is supposed to have another piece, a predella. This was lost in 1568 by a restorer who removed it. It underwent another restoration in 2012. That cost $2.4 million. So we have Christ in judgment, we have Mary on one side and John on the other. So let's focus in on this Mass for a moment. We have a lot going on here. So all of the bottom images are people coming to this Mass. In the center, we have the Lamb. This is, of course, Christ being depicted as a lamb on the altar. This is all outside. And as the sun is the Holy Spirit as the dove. Coming in even closer, we can see the halo emanating from the head of the lamb, and we can see the blood spurting into the chalice used for the Mass. And we see all of the angels holding things around, including the crown of thorns, the cross, the whip that he was used on him, as well as the column that he was tied to and whipped. Now, as part of this restoration, you notice that the image of the lamb has gotten more detailed. There was a lot to do about this on the internet, and so because the restored image does look a little more human-like than the previous image. Here's a detail of, again, Cain and Abel in the top, and then we have Adam there. There's Eve, and there's the actual Cain killing Abel. And there they are with the angels. As I said, this was originally stolen by Hitler's army. Hitler wanted this for his museum. We'll talk a lot more about this in a later chapter. But this is an image of the Allies actually rescuing this. This was at the salt mine. But this also gives you a really good sense of the scale, having these people next to these parts. You can see the detail work. On the upper right, you can see that 1 centimeter. You can see just the detail of every single stone is amazing. And on the bottom right, you can see how it is being protected. So it's actually surrounded by a special inert gas. The glass it is surrounded by is bulletproof. It is meant to keep it in pristine condition for a long time to come. And this is a painting of it as it would have been actually in the cathedral originally. Another piece by Jan van Eyck is Man in a Red Turban. Some people actually argue that this was a self-portrait of his. Beautiful details on the turban itself. Look at all of the folds. Look at how the garment is being rendered. We have highlights and lowlights, and we really get the sense that this is an actual piece of cloth you can touch. You can even have the details of his face, the lines around the eyes. The detail work is utterly amazing. Now, interestingly, you can see that there's actually writing on the frame itself. So we can see that it says, Als ik kan, or as I can, or as best I can. It's written in Flemish and then transposed into Greek letters. It also is signed Jan van Eyck in 1433, and so some interpret this as saying it's a self-portrait. Now this is another piece that has a lot of details in it. This is the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck. It is of Giovanni Arnolfini, who was an Italian merchant living in Brugge. He held posts in the court of Philip the Good and later the governor of finance for Normandy. We believe the woman is Giovanna Zanami, who was his wife. They had no children. Later, he had a public affair. They were married in 1447. For many years, this was thought to be a wedding portrait of the two of them. There's been later people who have been arguing that this is not their wedding portrait, and instead actually could be Giovanni di Arrigo or even his cousin Giovanni Nicola Arnolfini. So it could be these other relations instead of Giovanni Arnolfini. A famous art historian, Panofsky, is the one who promoted the wedding portrait theory, which you will still hear a lot of people talking about. Her shoes are red, and they're by that red bench. His shoes are the wood ones that are in the far left corner. Her dress is green. No, she's not pregnant. She's just lifting up her dress so you can see the blue under dress there, the other part of her dress. Now we also have a dog on the bottom. The dogs are oftentimes included as symbols of loyalty. But let's focus in on this wonderful mirror in the background. So this is one of the reasons why it was thought to be a wedding portrait. And again, it could be, but it might not be of Giovanni Arnolfini. First of all, we have Jan van Eyck was here, basically written on the top there and dated. So that could be kind of his statement. We have the crystal prayer beads, crystal being purity, and again, oftentimes crystal prayer beads were given as a wedding gift. And then we had the reflection in that mirror. So we have the back of both the man and the woman, and then we see two men in between them. We think, again, if you're thinking this is a wedding portrait, that they might be maybe the bride's father, and one might be Van Eyck witnessing the wedding. Surrounding the mirror are the Stations of the Cross. You'll also notice there's a single burning candle in the chandelier. Some interpret this as the eye of God. There's also an orange on the window. Again, could be representing the forbidden fruit, or even the golden apples of Hesperides. Rogier van der Weyden, Descent from the Cross. His real name was Rogelet de la Pasture. He trained with Robert Campen. This is a center panel of a larger altarpiece, 80 by 103 inches. This was commissioned by the Crossbowmen's Guild of Louvain. Louvain was near Brussels. This is the moment that Christ is lowered from the cross. We have John the Evangelist in the left. We have Mary Magdalene on the far right because she is shown with an ointment jar. The Virgin Mary is the one that is swooning. The skull represents the skull of Adam and the sins of mankind. Nicodemus is the one that is holding Christ's feet. Joseph of Arimathea holds his torso. You will notice that there is no landscape. There seems to be actually a backdrop, a background, something, a wall that is keeping the background from showing. The blue for Mary's dress is made from crushed up lapis lazuli, a very expensive stone at the time. The tracery in the corners, which presumably would have been mimicked in the actual frame itself, actually has crossbows in it. Again, this was paid for by the Crossbowmen's Guild. You will also notice that the figure there in the background, he's actually holding the bloody nails that they've had to remove to take down Christ's body. Overall, this piece has a very crowded feel. All of the figures are hitting against the sides of the piece, specifically behind the cross, but all of the figures are hitting some side, a bottom, a side, something. That's making us feel uneasy with this. Here's a detail of the crossbows there in the tracery. There's a detail of the bloody nails. Here is Roger van der Weyden's St. Luke drawing the Virgin. I had mentioned previously about the story that St. Luke had a vision of the Virgin and Child coming to him and he painting them. And that is what this is. It's actually based on another work by Van Eyck. Interestingly enough, again, we have it set in a contemporary household with a very contemporary city in the background. Now, Luke is actually drawing in silver point. This is something very common at the time. So the stylus is silver, and it's a specially prepared paper, has special chemicals on it, in which the silver stylus, once it touches the paper, it makes gray marks. Again, St. Luke is the patron saint of painters. This tapestry is of Penelope weaving. This is woven with threads of wool and silk. This is part of a famous women's series commissioned by the Bishop of Tournai. This is Penelope. She is the wife of Odysseus. So he's off doing his travels, and she's having to fend off these suitors that are insisting that she should marry them. She keeps saying, I'll make my decision as soon as I'm done with this tapestry. So she weaves all day, and then she unweaves all night to never finish and never cheat on her husband. This is a diptych of Martin van Nieuwenhove. This has the Madonna and Child on one side and Martin van Nieuwenhove on this other. This is by Hans Memling. So we know that this is the patron because of an inscription there on the piece. We also see the Virgin and Child are located in his house. We notice that the stained glass behind her has Martin's family's coat of arms. So again, it looks like she's in the house with him. Behind Martin is in stained glass, Saint Martin. We also see that his Bible there, his gilt edges, is very elaborate, so we know that he is a wealthy individual.